Welcome back. In our last series of lectures, Keynes Section 2, we constructed for you the IS and the LM curve. In this section, Keynes 3, we're going to look at how fiscal and monetary policy impact the IS and LM model. We'll talk about the effects of fiscal policy and the effects of monetary policy. We'll also want to look at the conditions under which each of these are more or less effective. We'll depict for you the crowding out that takes place in this Keynesian model, and we'll contrast the views of Keynes, classicals, and possibly an extension, a modern extension of the classicals called the monetarists. First, let's start with monetary policy. Let's start at equilibrium A. This is on IS naught and LM at a level of money M naught. The interest rate is R naught and the level of income is Y naught. Supposing that there is an increase in the money supply, this creates a situation of disequilibrium in the money market where at interest rate R naught and Y naught, we would have excess money supply. With the extra money, individuals buy bonds, and this, of course, pushes up bond prices and drives down interest rates. As the interest rate begins to fall, we start to return to an equilibrium in the money market through encouraging additional money demand. But there's a secondary effect of what's happening here outside of the money market, and that is in the product market. As interest rates fall, it causes investment to increase. As investment increases, the level of income is to rise. So, as the level of income increases, that also increases money demand, together with falling interest rates. Overall, it's these two forces that are restoring equilibrium in the money market. One, falling interest rates, and two, rising income. These two forces will compete for which will close the disequilibrium in the money market faster, and the overall impact will reflect whether or not the increase in the money supply was largely felt by falling interest rates or by an increase in income. To the extent that the increase in money is reflected in rising income rather than falling interest rates, money policy will be regarded as being more effective. On the other hand, if it's falling interest rates and not rising income that close us to equilibrium in the money market, then monetary policy will be less effective. As the interest rate falls from R0 to R1, we end up riding down the IS curve. Interest rates are falling, investment is picking up, and a multiplier effect is stimulating the level of income. In this model, an increase in the money supply results in lower interest rates and an increase in income. Overall here, our increase in income would move from Y0 to Y1. Note that the falling interest rates are encouraging investment. Monetary policy has worked through stimulating the private sector investment. This is not crowding out, this is crowding in. We have two panels. The first depicts an ISLM model with a relatively steep IS schedule, and that steep IS schedule reflects that there is a low interest elasticity of investment. Panel B has a relatively flat IS schedule, and this, of course, depicts a very high sensitivity of investment to changes in the interest rate. The LM curves in panel A and panel B are drawn to be exactly the same, so that's sort of benign. And what we're seeing here is that in panel A, as the money supply increases, the LM curve shifts from LM0 to LM1. This puts pressure downwards on the interest rate, but as the interest rate falls, investment is not very sensitive. It doesn't pick up a lot, and so it doesn't stimulate a large multiplier effect on the level of income. As a consequence, an increase in money demand from rising income is not felt significantly in the money market, and interest rates have to continue to fall to bring up money demand. In panel A, we have a very steep IS curve, and this is leading to a fairly ineffective monetary policy. In panel B, the same scenario plays out. We see an increase in the money supply. The LM curve shifts out from LM0 to LM1. This puts pressure downwards on interest rates. But in panel B, investment is very sensitive to falling interest rates. We get a boom to investment and a large multiplier, meaning that the level of income will grow by a larger amount than in panel A. Our problem with increasing the money supply, the disequilibrium in the money market, was excess money supply. In panel B, we're bringing up money demand to meet the new higher money supply, and the main channel through which we're closing that disequilibrium in the money market is an increase in income. So the rule of thumb here is that situations in which money supply is expected to be a very powerful force in moving the equilibrium level of income are: one, when the IS curve is relatively flat, and this represents a high interest elasticity of investment and or a large marginal propensity to consume or multiplier. And in the second case, where the LM curve is relatively steep and we have a low interest elasticity of money demand. When we have a low interest elasticity of money demand, interest rates are going to have to move by a lot more to close disequilibriums in the money market, and that will lead to larger impacts on investment and therefore income. Note that for the classicals, they believe the LM curve is vertical. Monetarists, on the other hand, feel that the LM curve is relatively steep. And so classicals and monetarists think that monetary policy is a hugely significant force in the economy. Now, for classicals, this means don't use monetary policy because it can generate inflationary trends very powerfully. For monetarists, they'll think that, well, monetary policy is very important and fiscal policy is not so important because it's not as effective. For both the classicals and the monetarists, monetary policy is viewed as being very powerful and therefore should be treated with tremendous caution to avoid setting off unnecessary price volatility. Let's turn our attention now to fiscal policy. Take a look at the graph and move your eyes to the equilibrium at point A. We'll be starting here. The interest rate is R0, the level of income is Y0. We're operating on an IS curve with a level of spending G0 and an LM curve LM0. An increase in government spending is going to shift the IS curve, and the bracket or the magnitude by which it will shift will be given by your fiscal policy multiplier that we learned about earlier. Now, if this was the end of the story, we'd move from Y0 to Y prime 1, and this would be if the full stimulative impact of the government spending was felt. And so let's just think about moving from Y0 to Y prime 1. With this shift, you're going to see a dramatic increase in income. That income increase will shift out money demand in the money market and will create a disequilibrium in the money market, one of excess money demand. Excess money demand will lead to people selling bonds, and so bond prices will fall and interest rates will begin to rise. As interest rates rise, money demand starts to decline to some extent. But this feeds back into the product market. Rising interest rates will reduce investment, and that reduced investment will hit a negative multiplier, reducing income. Here there are two forces restoring equilibrium in the money market. The disequilibrium was excess money demand, and it's rising interest rates and falling income that are restoring equilibrium in the money market. Here we begin moving up the IS curve, ISG1, as interest rates rise and investment declines. Eventually we reach the equilibrium point B, which is an equilibrium point in the money market, and that occurs at a higher interest rate, R1, and a lower level of income than we saw from the initial positive government shock, Y1. These rising interest rates and falling investment are exactly what we referred to in the past as crowding out. So the crowding out here is movement from Y'1 to Y1. The effectiveness of fiscal policy depends upon how much crowding out takes place. For classicals, the LM curve is vertical, and so crowding out is total and complete. Remember, it's rising interest rates and falling income that are restoring equilibrium to the money market. To the extent that income falls by a large amount, fiscal policy will be ineffective at stimulating economic activity. Let's look at the conditions underneath which this is true. Here we have two panels for you, panel A, panel B. Both of them depict an LM and IS model. In both of these panels, the LM curve has the same slope. The difference between these two panels is the slope of the IS schedule. In panel A, the IS schedule is relatively steep. In panel B, the IS schedule is relatively flat. You can see that in measuring the effectiveness of fiscal policy, we want to see what the larger impact on the change of income would be. And panel A has a more effective fiscal policy structure than does panel B. In panel A, you probably have a very high interest elasticity of money demand, so that as interest rates are rising, they quickly absorb excess money demand, and you don't need to see a lot of pressure on investment. Also in panel A, you have a very low interest elasticity of investment, meaning that as interest rates rise, it doesn't reduce investment by a large amount, and therefore it doesn't reduce income by a large amount. For this reason, the increase in interest rates has a smaller diminutive impact on investment and output, and consequently, the positive shock from government spending is largely retained. If we have a relatively flat LM curve, I think you could see that this shift out in IS would get even larger. So a relatively flat LM curve and a relatively steep IS schedule make a nice environment for strong fiscal policy. In panel B, we have just the opposite. We have a very flat IS curve. This means that, investment is very sensitive to changes in interest rates. So as those interest rates rise, there's a large reduction of investment and a large subsequent reduction in income, such that it's falling income that restores equilibrium in the money market and not so much rising interest rates. In panel B, the fiscal policy environment is likely to be very weak. Do note that the conditions for effective fiscal policy are just the opposite of the conditions for effective monetary policy. And so scholars will debate when there's a recession or an overly expansive economy how to deal with it. Would fiscal policy be more effective than monetary, or would monetary be more effective than fiscal policy? You'll remember that Keynes views the IS curve as being relatively steep and the LM curve being relatively flat. And so Keynes would have argued for aggressive fiscal policy in the wake of the Great Depression. Monetarists and classicals view the LM curve as being vertical, and so they think, of course, that fiscal policy will be totally ineffective or relatively ineffective in the monetarist case. Let's look at a contractionary tax policy. An increase in taxes is going to lower the economy by the magnitude of the tax multiplier. In our graph, panel B, We start at point A on LM naught and IS naught. We see the tax increase shift the IS curve back. And so at R naught, we no longer have equilibrium in the money market. Income has fallen to the point to reduce money demand, and this has caused excess supply of money in the money market. Well, subsequently, there's bond purchases, and that pushes up bond prices and generates falling interest rates. As the interest rates fall, business investment will start to uptick, and we'll start riding down the IS schedule towards point B at a lower interest rate, R1. This increase in income reduces the contractionary intent of the fiscal policy and has reduced the effectiveness of fiscal policy. Again, we see that this reduction in Y would have been larger if we would have had a flatter LM curve. This simply reiterates what you already know. Fiscal policy is more effective with a relatively flat LM curve. Fiscal and monetary policy used in concert. Regardless of the slopes of the IS and LM curves, fiscal policy can be effective if it takes place in concert with accommodating monetary policy. Let's start off at Y naught and R naught and imagine, if you will, a fiscal policy that shifts the IS curve out to the right. This could either be an increase in government spending or, as is in the case here, a reduction in taxes. We know that this expansionary fiscal policy would create excess money demand in the money market, and that would drive up interest rates. But in this case, the excess money demand is not met by selling bonds and changing interest rates. It's instead provided by the central bank in the form of an increase in the money supply. This eliminates the crowding out effect that would normally curb the effectiveness of fiscal policy and allows for the full brunt of fiscal policy to be felt in the market. Keep in mind also that if the central bank were targeting the interest rate, then the LM curve would be flat, and so fiscal policy would be extremely effective. Also note that there are other things that shift the IS curve other than fiscal policy, things such as investor expectations. In the case of a flat LM curve or a relatively flat LM curve, volatility in investor expectations will create a lot of volatility on the equilibrium level of income. This is one of the downsides of having an economy structured with a relatively flat LM curve. But it also has the consequence of saying, well, if volatility in the IS curve from investment demand will significantly impact the equilibrium level of income, we at least have fiscal policy that will be effective at combating that volatility. Last but not least, let's look at the liquidity trap. In a liquidity trap, the only effective macroeconomic policy is fiscal policy. We've seen before that an increase in the money supply has no stimulus effect on the economy since it doesn't lower interest rates. The LM curve is flat during a portion when you're representing the liquidity trap. And in that case, the movements in the IS curve become very potent at influencing the equilibrium level of income. Consequently, it becomes imperative that governments, quote unquote, keep their powder dry. This means they're going to maintain adequate budget surpluses or adequate access to financial markets for borrowing. If the debt limit has been reached and international markets do not think that buying government debt is attractive, then there simply will be no room for fiscal policy, and in an LM curve, there's no effectiveness of and in a liquidity trap, there's no effectiveness of monetary policy. So that could be a very bad situation for a country to have lost its fiscal and monetary policy through mismanagement of debt levels. That concludes this series of narrated lectures. we'll be back with more as we move forward in the class.